Welcome to the Environmental Crimes Financial Toolkit podcast, where we explore the fastest growing threats at the intersection of environmental destruction and financial crime. Environmental crimes, illegal logging, wildlife trafficking, illegal mining, and other offences, generate hundreds of billions of dollars annually. These aren't just conservation issues. They're sophisticated financial crime operations involving money laundering, corruption, and transnational organised crime networks that move illicit proceeds through the global financial system. This podcast series brings together the people on the front lines of this fight: financial crime experts, environmental investigators, law enforcement officials, regulators, and banking practitioners. Together, we'll examine how environmental crimes actually work as financial operations, what red flags financial institutions should watch out for, and how better collaboration between sectors can disrupt these networks. Whether you're a compliance professional trying to understand environmental crime risks, a regulator developing policy, or simply interested in how financial systems enable and can help stop environmental destruction, this series will give you practical insights and real-world perspectives. I'm Olivia Dakeen, and this is the Environmental Crimes Financial Toolkit podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Chris Batt, an anti-money laundering expert. He has spent 12 years with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime as an anti-money laundering and counter-finance terrorism mentor across the Mekong region and wider Asia Pacific, following a long career as a criminal investigator with the British Police, where he specialised in money laundering and asset recovery. He's also worked extensively on combating the illegal wildlife trade and has really borne witness to environmental crime money laundering from every single angle: operation investigations, policy development, and training financial intelligence units. Chris and I have also actually both worked on a Council of Europe project for which he co-authored a regional review paper on corruption and money laundering risks associated with environmental crime in the Western Balkans, for which I co-authored the corresponding guidance paper. So our paths have very nearly crossed before. Chris, welcome. It's really lovely to have you with us today.
And thank you. It's good to see you, and thank you for inviting me to partake in this podcast.
You're very welcome. So, Chris, let's start with the fundamental question. Many financial institutions still think of environmental crime as primarily a conservation issue or maybe a reputational ESG concern. But from your perspective, both as a former investigator and as someone who's trained FIUs, that's financial intelligence units, across multiple countries, why is environmental crime relevant to financial institutions, specifically from a money laundering perspective?
It's a very good question, actually. And just to add, maybe at this point, I also did some work with the regulated sector, particularly the banking sector and other parts of the financial sector. So I do see this from both the law enforcement FIU side, but also from the industry side. It's important because whilst it's understandable that financial institutions tend to look at environmental crime as an environmental issue, not necessarily a criminal issue. But where it is a crime, and it is a crime now generally across most jurisdictions, it's included in domestic legislation under certain categories. But where it is a crime, then the country's money laundering regulations will still require the financial institution to monitor transactions which they either believe or suspect are related to crime. And if the circumstances exist, to report those suspicious transactions to the country's FIU. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a drug crime, corruption, or any other kind of criminal offence. If the transaction is suspected to be linked to crime, then it should be reported. And I perhaps should also maybe clarify at this point, quite often the financial institutions don't know what the predicate crime is or might be. What they do see are suspicious transactions that don't make economic sense, transactions that are not in keeping with the customer's profile. It doesn't match their know your customer profile. It's not often the bank will necessarily identify the actual crime to begin with. They might later, but not necessarily. What they do know is that the transactions are suspicious. And so environmental crime is no different to any other crime. It needs to be reported.
Absolutely. So financial institutions really do need to be looking into this. So if we can get into the mechanics of how it actually works, what are the most common money laundering typologies that are specific to environmental crimes? And I'm particularly curious as to whether these fundamentally look different from traditional predicate offences, things like drug trafficking or fraud, that banks are perhaps more used to detecting, or whether it's actually a very similar playbook.
Well, there's two parts really, or two answers to that one question. First and foremost, environmental crime, or the proceeds from environmental crime, the financial flows from environmental crime, generally speaking, follow very similar mechanisms to other crime types. You mentioned drug trafficking, corruption, fraud, human trafficking. All those predicate crimes generate illicit profits. Those profits have to be cleaned or laundered in one way or another. And what we've found over the years is that organized crime gangs, organized crime syndicates tend to utilize the same methods, the same mechanisms for different types of crime. So, we are aware, for example, of organized crime getting involved in environmental crime, and they're using the same routes or mechanisms that they've been previously using for the trafficking in people or weapons smuggling or whatever their other criminal activities are. So that's one issue. But what I've also found is that financial intelligence units, I give you an example, in North Macedonia, the FIU there is very, very proactive, and they looked at a number of suspicious activity reports coming into the FIU from the banking sector. And to begin with, they thought the transactions related to corruption because of the individuals involved, their links to government and to the awarding of contracts, etc. And yet when they dug deeper, they then discovered that actually other players in the transactions, other actors in the transactions, were already involved in environmental issues. And the environmental side only became clear much later on. And so, again, as I said at the very beginning, financial institutions don't always know or fully understand what it is they're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that convergence is very, very tangled often in environmental crime cases, isn't it? So I want to dig a little bit more perhaps into some of the specific money laundering mechanisms that you've seen. And maybe we can talk about trade-based money laundering, because this is particularly relevant to environmental crimes since they often inherently involve physical commodities, things like timber and minerals and wildlife products moving across borders. So how do criminals use trade-based money laundering specifically in environmental crime contexts, and what should financial institutions be watching for in trade finance and commodity transactions?
Well, in trade-based money laundering, it's a multitude of different aspects. I mean, you have at the very basic level over or under invoicing of the commodities. You've got the falsifying of shipment manifests, the shipping documents, clearly very just fictitious descriptions of what's actually been transported through the ports. You have the use of offshore companies, shell companies, nominee directors, all of which are used to layer and to conceal the true identity of the actors who are involved in all this. And I mean, you mentioned timber, and that's a very good example, because there were a couple of cases, one in Madagascar, one in Brazil, where because the countries were already focusing on timber as a risk in money laundering, and I'll talk possibly about the national risk assessments in money laundering later, but because timber from both those countries was a high risk for money laundering, then the authorities were already looking very carefully at the ports and what was going through them. And as a result of that extra focus, they were able to identify a sudden increase, in the case of Madagascar particularly, a sudden increase in the flow of timber leaving the country. And when they looked at the paperwork, it didn't work on many levels. The quantity, the nature of the timber that was going out, and the companies that were being cited as being involved were all later found to be very either bogus or just completely false.
Yeah, so it's sort of acting as a red flag for environmental crime almost, and seeing the presence of trade-based money laundering and red flags associated with that. So if we shift to the corporate structure side of things, environmental criminals also exploit things like shell companies and nominee directors, the very classic beneficial ownership obfuscation techniques. So how does this manifest in environmental crime? And is there anything that makes it particularly challenging from a due diligence perspective?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is the fact that many jurisdictions don't really have a robust enough beneficial ownership record or process to look at who's behind the companies. And then when you add that to the fact that the same jurisdiction probably doesn't consider environmental crime as a huge issue, then that compounds the problem. So beneficial ownership has been and remains a major challenge for jurisdictions, not just in environmental crime, but across all kinds of predicate crimes where the proceeds are being laundered. And so One of the things that the Financial Action Task Force has been looking at and has looked at over the last couple of years is this issue of beneficial ownership. And then as we start to explore the issue of environmental crime, it comes up more and more and more. And so, yeah, beneficial ownership, as you know, it is so easy to acquire a shell company or an offshore company. I mean, you only have to Google any of the company formation agents in many of these jurisdictions, and I won't necessarily name one now, but you can find it so easily. And for the price of say $600 and the best part of an hour online, you could come away today the proud owner of the proud director of a shell company and in a very sunny jurisdiction. And it is easy to do. And so, of course, the more sophisticated organized crime syndicates are exploiting that particular vulnerability. There's no doubt about it. But that said, we mustn't forget the other methods of laundering money, even the most basic one, which is simple bulk cash smuggling across borders. That is still to this day a very popular and common route. I did some work in Cambodia only a couple of years ago, where Cambodian customs seized over $9 million in 3 separate transactions where passengers were just simply arriving into Cambodia with suitcases full of US dollars. It's a very old and tried and tested mechanism. And the reason it's still used is because criminals know that the financial sector is increasingly becoming more and more alert to how their institutions can be abused. And so it's an old-fashioned method, but it's still one that's popular. So we mustn't forget that. But yeah, the beneficial ownership still common, increasingly, where more sophisticated crime gangs are involved.
Yeah, absolutely. That's huge volumes of money that we're talking about, really. There, isn't it, in that cash-based smuggling? So,
Yeah.
if we bring this from theory into practice, perhaps with some real cases, maybe you can share some real-world examples of environmental crime, money laundering cases that have been successfully prosecuted, or perhaps just as importantly, cases that weren't successfully prosecuted, and what lessons financial institutions should take from these.
Well, let me give you the example, or let me develop the example I gave you from Brazil, because that was a successful environmental crime and money laundering prosecution. As I say, it was discovered because environmental crime, particularly timber, was a feature in the country's national risk assessment for money laundering. That in turn allowed the country to devote additional resources to timber crime, and as a consequence, that extra sort of focus at the ports, that was able to identify illegal, illicit timber being trafficked or being moved out of the country. A fairly large number of individuals were arrested and prosecuted, and included, corrupt officials who were obviously turning a blind eye to some of the shipments. But a significant amount, I think it was something in the region of 20 million US dollars, was eventually seized and confiscated from that particular crime. Now, contrast that with a case in Albania where, again, it was timber trafficking or timber crime. And although the investigation reaped results, the results were only corruption charges against the officials involved. The actual environmental crime aspect was completely left out of the prosecution's strategy. I'm not really sure why that was, but they made that operational decision. What we're looking at here are corrupt officials signing away authorities to in effect, illegally harvest timber in parts of Albania. That timber was harvested, illegal profits were made, and in the end, through a series of whistleblower and good investigations, the case was brought, but it was only corruption charges that were brought, not actual environmental crime. And that case, or those series of cases, are still ongoing. They haven't been fully completed yet.
Yeah, it's a real shame how that environmental crime angle often gets lost, doesn't it? Just based on different countries' sort of priorities and legislative frameworks. So, Chris, you've really seen this from every angle: investigations, policy, training. If I could ask you a forward-looking question, based on everything that you've seen, what is the one thing that you wish financial institutions understood better about environmental crime, money laundering? Something that you think would make the biggest practical difference?
Well, it's a question I'd like to answer, but also add not just the financial institutions, but the FIUs and the law enforcement, because the two go hand in hand. If the law enforcement agency's got financial investigation capability and those financial investigators working closely with the FIU, inevitably they will, rub shoulders with the financial institutions. They've got to do it. There's no avoiding it. And so the two sides of the coin will come together. From the financial institutions' point of view, what they need are some clearer sort of, I don't like using the phrase red flags, but they need some clearer highlights, if you will, of what they're looking for, what stands out as a transaction that potentially is linked to environmental crime. And probably one of the best ways of doing that is to share and circulate with the institutions past cases. I mean, you can obviously redact them if you need to, but the actual typology, if you will, of how a an environmental crime case, the proceeds were laundered through an institution, would help to give other institutions that kind of heads up. Now, not every country does this, but I know the United Kingdom does. All the institutions, even though they're in direct competition with each other for business, that's obviously the nature of the world they live in. But the one area they come together in is anti-money laundering. And so the money laundering reporting officers from the financial sector in the UK get together quite regularly to share typologies, to share identities or the names of, rogue customers or criminals, but also they share intelligence amongst themselves. Because, one bank doesn't want to onboard a customer that another bank has got rid of because of criminality. Now, that doesn't happen in every country. I can tell you that with certainty. And so a closer cooperation between the financial institutions on that side, sharing intelligence, would be useful. And then just a general sort of a wider awareness of some of the, let me use the phrase red flags, of the kind of transactions, the mechanisms, the typologies that can lead to the identification of a suspicious transaction linked to environmental crime. Now, from the law enforcement side, one of the curious things that I've sort of banged on about, if you will, for years and years is that this is not new. Following the money in criminal cases is not new. It's been around since the 1970s. The police in the UK and the US, we were following the money in drug cases from all those years ago. And yet, to my complete and utter surprise, as you roll into the 2000s, it wasn't happening in other crime types. Corruption, wildlife, the wider environmental crime. It just wasn't happening. And it's taken time for jurisdictions to, I wouldn't say wake up to, but deploy the necessary resources to following the money in our case today, environmental crime cases. Because as you probably know, environmental crime, and it certainly was the case with wildlife trafficking, it wasn't always resourced. The police response, if you will, wasn't always resourced sufficiently. So whilst drug traffickers and human traffickers, corrupt officials, were being investigated by well-resourced, well-trained individuals, that wasn't necessarily the case in environmental crime. And that is beginning to change. And the last thing I would say on that is, the Financial Action Task Force, many of the people watching this podcast will be familiar with the role of the FATF in setting the international standards for money laundering. But one of the first recommendations, well, it is the first recommendation, is countries should carry out national risk assessments. And what hasn't been happening is that jurisdictions haven't included environmental crime as a risk in their national risk assessments. Now, that might be because they don't see it as a risk, but quite often it's because they don't realize it's a risk. They're still focused on those old predicate crimes of drug trafficking, corruption, or whatever. And so if it's not in the national risk assessment, it's not a risk. And if it's not a risk, it's therefore not a priority for resourcing. And so those are the issues which are now beginning to change.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. So before we wrap, do you have any final words of wisdom for financial institutions who are perhaps just starting to take environmental crime, money laundering seriously?
Well, two things. They need to realize that this is as serious as failing to report a suspicious transaction linked to drug trafficking, for example. No financial institution wants to be caught out by failing to comply with their own domestic money laundering regulations. So the financial institutions now need to consider that environmental crimes, be it timber trafficking, land grabbing, illegal mining, hazardous waste dumping, all those are, if they are a crime in their country, in their country's domestic law, then they need to be on the lookout for it. I mean, it is obvious we're asking the banks to do more and more and more in relation to the combating of crime generally. But you can see how easy it would be for a financial institution to miss a environmental crime transaction whilst focusing on something that they think is more serious. And yet environmental crime is serious and it's causing a number of problems globally. So I think the financial institutions have to, accept that responsibility is just as serious as it is with other crimes, albeit with the caveat that most banks don't necessarily understand what the predicate crime is when they see the suspicious transaction. But a little bit of digging, some, good analysis, intelligence gathering work may point them in the right direction. But anyway, that is one thing they need to consider. But the other thing is sharing of information, and where you've got good, relationships with your competitors, other people, other organizations in the industry, the sharing of information is key. And that, I think, is something that some jurisdictions could do more of or could do better.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Well, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me along. It's been really nice to meet you and to take part in this podcast. Thank you.
You're welcome. For our listeners, if you're finding this series valuable, please share it with colleagues in compliance, risk or financial crime teams, because the more financial institutions understand their role, as Chris said, in detecting and disrupting environmental crime, the more effective we can all be together. Next episode for World Wildlife Day, we'll be speaking to Ben Brock, a senior wildlife crime analyst at Traffic. You can find more information about the Environmental Crimes Financial Toolkit at wearethemis.com/UK. Thanks for listening.